gotta roll them dice. You never know if it could change your life.
Were you surprised at all that the most popular published module for 5th edition is Waterdeep Dragon Heist?
I actually was not surprised. I think that they did a really good job of both hyping that it's a really good module. I also think it's pretty easy to run. Well, actually, it is easy to run and modify, and I think it like really fits with the type of game that most players these days are wanting to run, in that it is very character heavy, very flavorful, very dynamic. It makes people feel a bit like they're probably in a Critical Role campaign or like a something like that. Lots of vibrant, interesting characters to seed your game with.
This data, though not the raw data, just the percentages, was released by the D&D Beyond folks of who had most viewed adventures. Mm-hmm. So I guess that's not purchased. There's a lot of questions I have about their data.
I know.
Waterdeep Dragon Heist, Curse of Strahd, Tomb of Annihilation, and the intro edition, Lost Mine of Phandelver.
Which makes sense, I think.
Most popular. Yeah, makes sense. So it's the intro ones, the most recent ones, and Curse of Strahd.
Which is good because, that makes sense to me. Curse of Strahd, I still think...
Rise of Tiamat, 1%. that one's a flub.
The other thing that they released was, and this was interesting, classes by tier of play. Yeah, sorry, I want to come back to that, but it's not super surprising that Waterdeep and Strahd are most viewed or most popular. I mean, I think people are looking for very character-heavy modules, right? I think people want to play with lots of fun and interesting NPCs rather than your grand and sweeping plot type modules. I guess this is in terms of popularity. This is my guess. I think based on what people get enthusiastic about online and where the new blood in D&D is coming from. This is just a theory, but
one thing that surprised me is there's actually there's less variation than I would expect in the classes people are playing. The least played class at a tier of play is at intro level characters is still more than half of the most popular class, right?
Yeah, it's very even.
There's not a huge amount of they're very evenly.
So this is wild, and I remember this from previous editions because it was the case there too. But still, Fighter is the most popular, or close to the most popular, and I think that's just because it appears to be the simplest. Though I gotta wonder if these numbers are skewed somewhat because it's D&D Beyond, and maybe people are just throwing up test characters or something like that are fighters. But in previous editions, when they did studies like this, Fighter was really, really popular. And I like fighters, but I feel like most people don't come to D&D saying, I want to be...
I do. I don't know about you, but I make fighters because I want to be able to hit things with weapons.
I mean,
it's cool.
I make fighters because that's the type of character archetype I enjoy. I just have this idea for some reason that most people come to D&D wanting to do something fabulous and fantastic, and I would assume that most people would want some sort of spellcasting, but that appears to not be the case. The two... most popular.
Never underestimate being the appeal of being a normal person in a world of fantastic creatures.
I mean, I love that, and maybe I shouldn't assume things about other people, but almost a full quarter of, again, tier 1, and so what that means, what do these tiers even
Levels
mean?
Levels 1 through 5, I think.
A full quarter at tier 1 are fighters and rogues, which is interesting. But so the one of the takeaways about this was that, and this isn't in the chart that I'm looking at here, but the analysis or in the video, was that most campaigns either end or peter out by 10. Which is not a surprise.
We've known this for a long time.
Which is not a surprise to anybody, but it's good to have hard data to back it up. So I feel like whenever people have conversations about classes post, I'm going to say 11 is the real cutoff for me, because that's when marshals get their third attack or whatever.
Right. Casters get 6th level spells.
I mean, that doesn't mean you have to end it there, but I feel like that's a very natural cap, unless you're going to take on Tiamat or something like that. But I feel like any discussion that talks about class power or class balance at level 20 needs to bear in mind that like 95% of people are never going to see play at that level.
Yeah. When you design a homebrew class or something like that, you really only have to worry about the first 10 levels.
And you should
if you
plan
can
it
get
out.
those right.
Anyway, interesting data. Release the data to us, wizards. Give us the data.
They won't. But that's fine.
We'll yell at them anyway.
Hey, welcome to our show.
That's right. This is a show. It's Dungeon Master of None.
I'm Dungeon Master Matt.
And I am Dungeon Master Rob. Thank you for listening to us talk about dungeon numbers. And
today we have, an episode on...
It's a world building episode.
World building, yes.
And we're going to be talking about politics and government and factions and economics and history. Are you bored yet? Good, because there's going to be a lot more of that.
Yeah, this is, I think, my favorite part of world building.
Me too.
I don't know, what really, floats your boat when you're working on your homebrew campaigns, but for me, factions and politics, for sure, top of the list.
Yeah, I enjoyed our last discussion on faith and magic and gods, but, when I start world building or even when I look at a fantasy world or start, what gets me excited is, what kind of government does it have? What are the power structures? What sort of people have power in this world? And that's because Matt and I are both hideous, filthy, traitorous Reds, Marxists who view history and politics through the view of, in some respects, material analysis. But that's what's interesting and fun to me.
Yeah. And I mean, there's, again, like we said before, there's no right place to start world building. Mm-hmm. You can start coming up with factions. You can start with a dungeon. You can start with the gods. You can start with what you want your first adventure to be and start world building. There are world builders who enjoy building an entire history and then, creating factions out of that. And I think that's fine. For me, I usually take a simpler approach as I come up with factions I find interesting and then maybe work in the backstory to explain those, work my way backwards.
Yeah, I encourage people to start with what they're interested in and then work out,
Yeah.
Whatever's most exciting to you, do that first. Get the fun stuff out of the way, and then start. You should naturally start to think about how these things interact with the rest of your world, and build out from around that. With my most recent world building project, I started with a city, and then I built a world around the city to sort of understand what it was like there.
Okay, so I think we should quickly introduce the worlds we're both working on as examples, and then, or should we talk about just some general, what makes a good faction or what makes politics interesting?
Yeah,
maybe we should do that first.
I was thinking over this, and I had a little spiel about factions and things. I just when you're thinking about, I think that. So we talk a lot about traditional fantasy, and I think that this is becoming less and less true. So every time I say this, I'm aware that it's been, subverted often and recently. But in traditional fantasy, there's a tendency toward feudal or monarchical power structures. There's just, unless otherwise stated, you can probably assume that there's a king or a queen, or a lord, or a baron, or a count, or a duke, or something like that. And to be clear, that is totally fine. And this is actually one area where it's not explicitly Eurocentric. The world over, throughout the pre-modern period, had kings, they had nobles, they had warlords. This is a very common power structure. So it's actually one thing that you can feel safe in including without, consigning yourself to a sort of Eurocentric worldview. But it is also, in my opinion, underexamined and kind of boring. And so when we were just talking about...
I only like feudal power structures when they're put into big sci-fi properties.
Exactly.
Like Dune or Battletech or something like that. It's
only cool to have a king if it's a space king.
Space kings are cool. If you're a duke because you own a planet, that's neat.
That's cool. If you're a duke because, you own a shitty backwater
castle
in France, that's not cool. There's nothing cool about that. But no, a space duke is awesome. But so what I like to do is I like to, just all it takes to make that a little bit more interesting is just to sort of examine it a little bit. If you're not super excited about government, or if you don't have like a good idea, assume there's a king. That's a totally like normal thing to do. But why does the king have power, or who has power? Is there a strong church? Do his nobles have a lot of armies of their own, and does he have to, deal with them? Is there perhaps, a strong guild structure? Maybe he's got like a power sharing arrangement with, his queen or something like that. Just kings, even in, no king ever ruled, by their might alone. They have, all these governments work by, bureaucracies and power structures and, delegation of duties. And so the first way to start thinking intelligently or building an interesting and complete world is to think about, where does the power come from? Who executes the king's orders? What allows him to rule? This is an interesting concept that is actually modeled in some games pretty decently, but I also want you to think about legitimacy. Think about, where does the right to rule come from? And this is like sort of a fuzzy concept that has a lot of like real world impact, because we all live in a delicate house of cards, a shared delusion that we call society. It relies on everyone pretending that it exists and that we believe in it. And the moment that people stop believing in it, it all collapses. And so what gives your king legitimacy? In fantasy, it can often be literally, they were told by a god or given like a holy scepter that has actual power that makes them king.
For more details, read Rob's complete book, more of a manifesto, really. Fantasy Society and Its Future, co-authored by Rob and Ted Kizin.
Anyway, I just rambled. Matt, get us back on topic.
Well, yeah, no, so I think monarchs are a fun way to go. I think some of the best politics is when you have a monarch who's basically a third-level commoner, or just a person with no special powers, other than, yes, they have the, some sort of right to rule. They exercise kingly justice, and they've got all the allies and people supporting them. But you can easily, draw on some pretty easy to reference for your player's history, to create other sorts of power structures, right? Mm-hmm. You could have a bizarre power structure that's a three-way sharing power arrangement between the church, the wizards, and the nobles, but players might have harder times digesting that. But you can easily go for something like a Roman Senate from the Republican era, where you have powerful families that have large estates, and they're constantly backstabbing each other for sort of positions in the Republic and gathering support. Or there's nothing wrong. We joked about how fun it is to put a feudal power structure into science fiction. There's nothing wrong with having a more modern power structure in a fantasy game, right? Having some sort of parliament, which is a medieval institution, or a president or an elected sort of thing that makes it that can lead to a lot of fun adventuring in a fantasy setting.
There are some very good examples of republics and parliaments and more decentralized or democratic power structures existing in the pre-modern era, and it's fun to include those. They tended to be squished by monarchs pretty aggressively, but you can have a republic, or you can have even a full-on democracy, and that can be a really fun and interesting thing to do in your fantasy game. There's plenty of examples to draw from. Or,
you could go for, pure warlordism or something like that is always fun in a game, right? Not only has your generic fantasy Roman Empire that we're all creating collapsed, but instead of being succeeded by, medieval feudal states, it's just pure warlords. They all live on giant wagon trains that chase each other across the desert.
Exactly. There's, yeah. You should have, the thing is, yeah, even if this isn't interesting to you, or if it's not like something that is particularly important to your world building, the best way to start thinking about this is, if you don't have something else in mind, is, who's the most powerful person in your region? And that, like Matt said, that may just be a warlord, or maybe a noble, or maybe an elected representative. But there's probably somebody, right? Somebody who has power and money and influence.
If I can add to that, right, I like to think of who's the most powerful person in the region that the players know about. Who's the most powerful person in a region that the players don't know about? Right?
That's great.
So if you can answer those two questions, maybe they're the same person in that, they have two different goals, but having those two creates that sort of interesting dynamic. If you can answer that for every major region of the campaign you're building, that works out pretty well.
I want to add a third one to that, which is who is the most powerful person that the players have met and will meet. Because I like your two.
The most powerful person they've met, the most powerful person they know about, the most powerful person they don't know about.
And I think that will give you basically a full picture of what whatever town or city they get to. You could easily imagine that's, they'll meet the local sheriff who reports to the baron, but the actual most powerful person is in fact, the bishop of the church or whatever, who wields, shadowy, backdoor politics to rule with an iron fist or whatever. It's just, those are the three. If you don't have like a robust power structure in place, or your players are taking you somewhere where you don't really have a bunch of notes, or you're trying to world build on the fly, those three things, and you can start to paint a pretty good picture of what the area that you're in looks like in terms of politics and government and factions and etc.
Cool. We like to start off pretty general and get more specific. Any other general advice on factions and world building? Then I have some slightly more specific questions for you, Rob.
No, I encourage people to think about. This is like we said at the beginning. This is the thing we're most excited about. I like to ask people to think about this. It's important to think about who has money and who has power and who has influence, and how they use that and how that affects your world. And that's really what the question of politics and government as factions is about, is what do they want? How do they get it? Who's got the power to make things happen, and how is that being exercised? The example that I really like, one of my very favorite, I've been rewatching this, my very favorite example.
This was my next question, was what is your favorite example?
Perfect. Well, let's go to the next one.
Let's do it.
I have a lot of good examples of this. My favorite in recent memory is actually The Expanse. And I think The Expanse, from the book series of the same name, I'm sure that we've all seen it. It's on, I think it's on Amazon now or something like that.
Sure.
It was on Sci-Fi. Canceled.
Yes.
Cowards. In favor of more ghost hunting shows. But it extrapolates a future that I think does a very good job of looking at where we are now and what, a theoretical future solar system would look like. And there's a lot of really interesting political and social dynamics that are based on, again, I think a very interesting thought experiment about what it would be like if our modern current world went on to colonize the solar system. And I think that the authors have thought a lot about politics and government and about, how people behave and, where power comes from and wealth and all that. And I think it's a really, really strong world that they have built for The Expanse.
Yeah, I think they have good politics, right? I think it's for your own example, the good takeaway from The Expanse is, if you're not sure how to set up sort of a global power structure for a region or the entire world, is give yourself 3 primarily aligned factions. And because if you build 2, unless you're Blizzard, it can be tough to pull off. So put in 3. 3 is the magic number.
3 is the magic number. The Expanse is also a great example of like little touches that I think show like a good understanding of their world and where it comes from. Matt pointed this out to me a while back and appreciated it, but a lot of the people who settled Mars are people from Texas, but they're of Indian or Pakistani descent. So they speak with like a Texas accent, but they're brown people, which is totally legit because there's a huge, diaspora in Texas, and it makes perfect sense for that to happen. There's also a huge like faction of Mormons that want to build a giant spaceship and go to another planet, which talk to your Mormon friends sometime about whether or not that would fit with their religion, because it actually...
You want to go to the Star Cobol?
Because it would. And yeah, so that's my example of really strong world building. It's top of mind because I've been rewatching it. But Matt, how about you?
I don't think you have to go all the way to think about like politics. You don't always have to think about power. Like a great faction that is, stood the test of time for Dungeons and Dragons is a great example. You should consider putting something like this in your own campaign world. Is just something like the Harpers from Forgotten Realm. A faction, they don't hold power in any geographic location, yet they are there trying to shape the events of the world. They have some sort of internal hierarchy. They have a clear goal, right? Maintaining balance and protecting both civilization and nature, and generally being good guys and can give your players a strong motivation to do something, right? These types of factions are players love them, and you should consider having something like this in your campaign.
What's really that's a great point. And what's really good about
they can be good guys. You can always twist them and make them villains.
What's really good about the Harpers is that this is a great example, and it works really well for Forgotten Realms and for D&D. What's good about the Harpers is that they still have like a bit of like an edge to them. They're still kind of inscrutable. Their motives are sometimes difficult to understand, or sometimes they can be extreme in their methods.
Maybe they're playing the really long game, and they're willing to sacrifice the player character's village,
right?
And everything they hold dear to preserve, some ancient evil from escaping.
Right, and you can
they're
usually
good guys, but
your players can usually be rest assured the Harpers are good guys, but maybe their methods are extreme, or maybe somebody involved with the Harpers is turning into a sort of extremist figure who's going too far in his pursuit of justice or whatever. The Harpers is actually a great example of a faction that has been around for a long time in D&D that definitely has stood the test of time. They're a great vehicle for players, and I think we'll get to this later, but I do fucking love secret societies and secret organizations for factions and for fantasy worlds. It's just so much fun to build in, subtle, behind the scenes players that are working at, deep and ancient purposes. People who are not motivated by, simple things like money or power or influence.
Okay. So these are like some of our, if you have any favorite factions, please let us know. But yeah, I think, and the great thing about homebrewing your stuff is you can just steal something. If you want the Harpers in your campaign world, you can just lift them and place them into it, right? Mm-hmm. Unless you're selling this for money, do that.
Well, and if you are, just change the name,
Right, who's going to know?
Who's going to know?
All right, should we take a quick break and talk about some specifics and come up with some factions right here on the pod?
Yes, I love it.
You are welcome to steal, and probably don't even have to change the name because we're not going to sue you.
We're not going to sue you.
You don't have any
money.
money.
Steal our factions. So we're back.
Rob and we're back, and we're both, as you know, building homebrew worlds along with you. And so let's talk about briefly introduce what those worlds are, and then we can come up with some factions and politics for those worlds.
My world is...
Do you have a name for it yet?
I'm like tentatively calling the setting...
Oh, your setting's called It's Cool. Love to play it, Rob.
Fuck off, Matt.
Dungeons and Dads.
Dungeons and Dads. Hi, stunned. I'm Drist. Anyway. So I'm tentatively calling it the Darien Scheme, which is a callback to a particularly tragic moment in actual real life history, but relates to something that's happening in game. But
hey, if the Darien Gap was not so impassable, the United States would have never been able to fucking blockade Colombia and
true.
Start a revolution in Panama and buy the canal off them for pennies on the acre.
Gosh, it is wild how that like little chunk of land has fucked over so many people's big plans. read up on it sometime. Scotland would never have become a part of the UK if it had not failed so catastrophically at this particular colonial venture. Anyway, so
okay, so your campaign is called the Darien Scheme.
It's my tentative title for just that sort of fine. Like the arc. And it's it's based very loosely on a sort of new world colonized by roughly Scots-type persons, but the indigenous people have substantially more power, and there's alchemy and different types of sources of magic. This is the one thing that I'm working on to make it interesting, and the key is that the colonizers have alchemical magic, which is dependent on literally expending gold and or quicksilver, which allows them to compete with the substantially better magic of the indigenous peoples, but not in the same way that it played out in a real life history. But it all takes place in this city. The idea is the city of Darien, where all of these sort of like different things come together. And naturally, there are quite a few factions and political forces involved in the very wealthy sort of entrepot of Darien, where a lot of trade and wealth. Entrepot. Sorry.
It's obviously a Scottish city and not a French one. You've got
is this the first time we've had a like major mispronunciation on the pod? Please dunk on me for my bad pronunciation of entrepot.
I am sure it is not. So we've got a city in the New World and lots of factions. I like to think of my factions, and tell me if this is useful, Rob, in sort of tiers. Nerds love tiers. I love tiers. Thinking about like, okay, here are the tier 1 factions that have influence everywhere and are world shaping. Here's tier 2 that only care about this one thing or are confined to a particular region. Here's some very local factions below them, right?
Yeah, and that's, I have not thought of dividing them into tiers, but I actually love that. And I usually have, big continent spanning factions and then smaller, regional ones and then local ones. But that's a great way to think about it. And also, they may have, actually a great way to think to do this is they have either explicit or implicit connections to each other. Somebody within a small faction is either actually working for a larger faction or they are a subsidiary of it. But I like this, Matt. This is a great way of thinking about factions. So Matt, describe your world before.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so Rob's working on Darien. I'm working on Wild Space, which is, as Rob joked, dungeon trained to the stars. It's basically, if you want to play Spelljammer in its own native setting, this is how you do it. Looking at the political situation, I knew I wanted the home base for my players to basically be, one really interesting star system or groups of star systems that's basically a fantasy federation. But instead of in Star Trek where the Federation, everything is already good and nice, I still want there to be tons of problems, conflicts between the player character races and planets and factions, elves and dwarves and all those types of things, huge chunks of areas that are undeveloped and unexplored, full of monsters and even more scary things. So there's that. There's a sort of fantasy federation of the player character races. And then the other big factions are going to be, large empires, a la Star Trek that represent, sort of extremes of opposites of the Federation. So that's where I'm coming from, like, for my big faction. So Wild Space, it's Spelljammer.
You've described this to me before.
Fantasy and space.
And I really like it. And I think that you've specifically learned from some of the long-term mistakes of other science fiction properties in having galaxy spanning empires or large polities and giving yourself room to work and build an interesting adventure in. This is me going off on a tangent, but I have watched quite a bit of Star Trek and I can never ever wrap my head around the galactic politics of it. It all sounds like nonsense to me. There's a giant happy federation where everybody is, doing fine, and then someone's getting mad at me. Don't get mad at me. I watched all
right. I'm not mad.
I can't figure out.
They cure diseases, Rob.
I can't figure out
where
the Romulans fit in. I can't figure out who's more powerful. Are the Klingons friendly. It seems like
it changes, Rob.
I know. Well, it seems obvious they built the Federation first, and they were like, oh wait, we have no room for conflict here. Let's create some, vaguely oppositional empires, but they never seem like fully well built out. I'm sorry. Yeah. I probably need to rewatch Deep Space Nine. It's been a long time. I was a teenager.
That's what I would say. Yeah. Well, so I wanted to, so I think Star Trek, and obviously this is very arrogant of me to try and do this as a person from the United States, but Star Trek draws heavily on American experiences during the Cold War. And I thought, I've been reading a lot of books about the Bandung Conference and the sort of a few moments during the Cold War of third world unity. Mm-hmm. And I thought, what if there was a Star Trek, fantasy Star Trek sort of based on people who got the short end of the historical stick, in short end of the historical shrift in actual history.
What if these coalitions actually succeeded? What if this third world unity wasn't squished by two, superpowers trying to
right?
Yeah.
So I guess to talk about the big factions, I wanted to avoid talking about history, but I guess the idea is that somehow there was some sort of magical crystal sphere protecting the player's home base system, or it was undiscovered. It was discovered by these big empires, divided up. They fought a ton of wars on them, but recently in the past was an earth-shaking event, a revolution, a revolt. The main system was able to expel the empires and set up their own sort of tenuous federation by playing them off of them. But, at any point in time, they could try and reinvade, right? So that's sort of the historical basis of these factions. So, okay, these are our two worlds, right?
Okay. So, I can start talking about my factions because I have a few.
Okay, let's start with some, to just chunk it up so we can go back and forth. Let's start with some tier 1 factions, S-tier factions.
Perfect.
Right?
I'm going to do
the Dr. Marios.
I'm going to do a little clicking. Give me a second.
No Zero Suit Samuses.
Yeah.
Bayonetta.
No Ganondorfs, which is my favorite. Anyway, yeah, so here's some tier 1 factions from the Darien scheme. So, the major player is the Caledonian League, which is a merchant. It's a vaguely Gaelic version of something like the
Hanseatic League.
Sorry, Jesus, why am I blanking on that?
Yeah.
And they're the sort of the trade company that controls Darien and the Cinnabar and Quicksilver trade in and out of there, so very wealthy, very involved in the area, but also riven by internal conflict and competing merchants, and so unable to sort of act. But there's a great deal of wealth and power concentrated in this particular merchant company, a bit like the East India Company.
So what do they want?
Well, they want to... So currently, the idea is that much like as it occurred in history, Darien is wealthy. Well, not... It is in a precarious position. So unlike in actual history, they succeeded in settling and they've created a wealthy and modern city, but it is precarious. It is surrounded by enemies and people who want to seize their wealth. And so the Caledonian League is on the back foot. And history... there's also history involved in mine, and like Matt, I don't like to usually make that a key. But in recent memory, there was an event back in Caledonia called the Rising. And as a key part of dealing with that, the Druid Kings of Caledonia made everyone forget. Nobody remembers what the Rising was or how it came to be or how it was resolved, but there's a large group of people living in Darien and the surrounding areas who are essentially indentured servants who are known as, who are brought there as a result of the Rising. And so they are trying to deal with massive social unrest and recover from this, catastrophic event back in the homeland. And so they're a tier 1 faction that is rapidly moving perhaps towards tier 2 status if other factions begin to take power in a way that is, significant.
This is a great faction for a role-playing game because a faction that wants profit and is sort of losing its status and seems to perhaps have little scruples, like they'll take any kind of player or any type of character, right? The players can easily do missions for them for money. There's no disadvantage for players wanting to join this
Right.
type of faction,
And in case you don't know me or haven't been listening, it's the idea I have is pretty obvious that, the campaign is going to involve either the collapse or, radical restructuring of the Caledonian League and the government of Darien, and that the players will probably start out working for somebody who works for the Caledonian League, but then have to decide what the future looks like for this part of the world, right? Because it can't sustain itself the way that it has been. So that's my number one tier 1 faction in this region of the world.
And this is an idea that I would love to steal for another one of my campaigns, is make the most important faction one teetering on the brink that will collapse partway through the campaign. And the players get to decide what to replace it with and how.
And that's one of my favorite tropes, and I love putting players at sort of like the fulcrum of history and having them make decisions about that.
Well, yeah, here, let's trade off. I'll do
let's
a
trade off.
tier
Yeah,
one
let's see another one of your tier 1s.
Well, okay, so Rob has chosen something depressing to remind all of his players about the horrible history of mankind and how to make everyone sad. So good job, Rob. Because I have joy still in my life. My first tier 1 faction, right, is if I want to think about my tier 1 factions, I would think of all the evil empires out there in space, right? I would think of the Magicratic Republic of Ioun, the Astrolith Ascendancy, the Dynasty of the Conqueror Worm, the Celestial Empire of Thune, all these things. But opposed to them is the sort of big faction that the players may start working for, which is, I'm just going to call right now the Union. A good socialist name. It's a fantasy federation that has just begun to expand. And I think it would be a great faction for the player, and that is, one, idealistic. They are sort of a neutral good faction of a sort of an interstellar, interspecies government. But plenty of room for evil characters to operate, evil NPCs to operate within this faction.
Chaos is a ladder, Matt. There's always opportunity for change. Anybody can see themselves aligning with, somebody who wants change, even if they don't necessarily have good intentions about what that change looks like.
And so I think, how does this basically faction only came to power because, the planets of the Union got lucky enough to play a couple of the big empires off each other and, signed some kind of peace or treaty where they got to be independent only because the more powerful empires didn't want each other to get it. So there's that. What does the Union want? Number 1, survival, more alliances, preventing another war from happening. Obviously, some people within the Union want another war. 2, recruitment. This gives players a strong motivation to go out to new planets, explore them, and find weird magical creatures to recruit to the side of the Union. 3, I think just trying to keep the internal factions of elves and dwarves and other species that I'm going to add to my campaign from basically slicing each other up.
I love it. And Matt is right that, actually this is really interesting because we have 2 wildly different tier 1 factions and different ways of motivating the players to work with or against them. That is correct, that I have picked one that nobody is going to want to really be a part of long term. And that I have reminded everyone of the depressing realities of life. And Matt has picked a forward-looking and optimistic one, and I appreciate that.
Well, and I think, but the key here is if you have a big faction that the players are a part of, give it a chance to evolve. Either collapse. I could see in one of my campaigns, right? The Union could just become another big interstellar evil empire if things go badly, right?
Right, exactly. And that's that's a key trope in a lot of, I think this is often done lazily. But it's true that even optimistic revolutionary peoples sometimes succumb to the bounds of
siren song
of power and become evil themselves. And so that's always an opportunity, even if you have a optimistic and freedom-loving and heroic group of people, that they can become corrupted by power.
Okay, Rob, give us another one of your bigger factions.
It's not all grim. There's other, like I said, in this new world, which I've tentatively called the Land of the Sun. And that's in the, native language. I haven't decided on how. I haven't finished my weird linguistic study. But there's a lot of different indigenous groups there, but the largest and most numerous are the Sun people, the people who live in the Land of the Sun. And I had this idea.
Sun elves?
Possibly. I want to talk on a different episode about what I do with ancestry and with races. But
right. That could be our next world building one, is
because I was thinking about that a lot, but I think I sidestepped the issue. But I was thinking about the mound builders. I was thinking about a lot of like ancient indigenous peoples in the Americas, and how there was this civilization that, as far as we can tell, just sort of walked away from their grand settled society. These enormous mounds at Cahokia and elsewhere.
There are a lot of theories. Was there climate change or sort of early diseases actually wiped out some of these smaller ones? But we
don't really know, and there's a lot of good reasons. But I was just thinking, that's so interesting, and so I had this idea of this incredibly numerous indigenous group that built these gigantic pyramids or settlements, and then sometime in the distant past just decided to leave and spread out and sort of had their own voluntary diaspora. And so they are everywhere in Darien and in the Land of the Sun, and they're great wanderers and travelers and artists and scientists, but they don't have sort of like a place of their own, but they come together every according to the astrological changing of the stars, every however many years, to meet and discuss, and then they are all awaiting a final Sundance to bring them all together and reunite the Sun people. And so they're a sort of a mysterious and often inscrutable group, difficult to know their motives, but they're generally pleasant to work with, and they're not malicious in any obvious way, and they have their own drives and desires, but can end up working with all sorts of other groups based on their own internal motivations. And so I have a lot of interesting plot hooks in mind for what they want eventually, and how they might work with the people in Darien, and how they might influence the outcome of events. But that's one of my more powerful tier 1.
I like those a lot, especially the sort of alternate take on, instead of a powerful empire, right? You have people who don't have the sort of permanent settlement, right? But still have a lot of both magical and technological power.
Right. And it works well in a fantasy setting because, they can maintain those bonds of power or still have, connection to each other without necessarily needing things that would not work.
Ascending spell, for example. Animal Messenger is a popular one. If I had to give another tier 1 empire, I think the other sort of tier 1 factions would be opposed to the Union. Sort of, I've got an evil race of humans, basically stolen from the traitor Baru Cormorant. I have an evil dragon empire, an evil empire that all wants to join in a collective and become a god. But then I figured it's useful to have some other big threats that are not obvious that should become a faction. So I was flipping through the monster manual. I'm like, which monster do I want to be behind a big galaxy spanning faction? And for me, maybe it's because it's the third one I came to. It's the Aboleths. Aboleths are super cool. They're ancient, perhaps the oldest creatures in the universe, or at least that's what they claim. And I'm definitely having them work in some background, right? If you look at some of the lore about Aboleths, they're like, oh, maybe their oldest world was destroyed and they were scattered. I might rename them for a space campaign, the Astroleths or something like that. I would say that most Aboleths are part of a like a galaxy-wide cabal. They call themselves the Ascendancy. But they are busy manipulating genetics, influencing the magic of portal networks and the spell jammers of basically maybe everyone else in the galaxy, right? They're never moving in the open, but their goal is just the same as the other empires, which is complete enslavement of all sentient life.
Aboleths are a great villain. They're also, in terms of balance, a very challenging encounter for their level, and just a super interesting creature. Have been for a long time. Matt, I love this because you can imagine that, like the navigators from Dune, they travel around on their spelljammers in like tanks.
Right, and they have a little special tank,
which is a like creepy thing for people to encounter, or like sort of like it's very evocative. And Aboleths are they enslave mortal races and bend them to their wills, and they live a long time, and it's a great idea for both an enemy that works in the open and also in secret, which
right. And then if you have a faction that like wants to work in secret, you can you always need a reason to have like ruins and dungeons scattered throughout your world. Maybe some other ancient alien civilization quashed their overt empire, and they're basically immortal. So they're like, well, okay, this time we'll try it the sneaky way,
right,
so we don't get squashed down.
And Matt makes a great point about like you probably want like not just a big bad like an individual or but like a big bad organization or a big bad faction. And I think one of the big things I did with my world was I was thinking, okay, let's try to make a world where all of the insane number of potential player races fit, or humanoid races fit. And so I was like, okay, where do all these come from? Where do they fit in? And there's a surprisingly large number of aquatic races. And so like Matt with the Aboleths, I was like, well, so maybe the surface world is all a part of a bunch of different kingdoms and empires and leagues, but there's this vast, immense ocean that is full of, and in my world, it's Sahuagin, and there's a just gigantic, incredibly powerful, underwater kingdom of Sahuagin, and their slaves and their subordinate races, and they don't always interfere with the surface world, but they have designs on it, and maybe they want to plunge the entire world and make it into a gigantic ocean, or maybe they want to turn all the coastal areas into chattel slaves for feeding for their sharks or for themselves. And so this is I haven't really decided on the exact structure of it, but I know that there's a vast empire, a kingdom of Sahuagin under the waves, and they are going to be an antagonist in a very powerful way for a lot of the factions in this world.
I can imagine a chapter climax in one of your adventures where the Sahuagin invade the city of Darien.
It's something I very much have in mind. Yeah, an invasion of Sahuagin, and there's such a I love them. There's so many great illustrations of Sahuagin. They're just terrifying shark people who ride sharks and worship awful devouring gods, and yeah, they're great.
Their only weakness, air.
So yeah, let's talk tier 2, and this is actually one of my favorite. I'm gonna break our order because I'm really excited to talk about a couple of things. And I do have some specifics, but I actually want to talk about sort of some frameworks for these, because in my mind there's some things that fit here. So in my world, in most fantasy worlds this makes sense, but I really like for tier 2, I like something like a mercenary company. I think a mercenary company, a particularly powerful one, makes a really great tier 2 faction. One that has achieved enough notoriety or power or success to have different branches, to have leaders, to be able to influence politics in a minor way, and have sort of their own goals. They still mostly work for other people, but they have, desires. They might be able to send adventurers out on their own to look for powerful artifacts. They might be interested in even doing some conquests of their own if they, become big enough for their britches. And so I think that this is great for any fantasy setting. Also, it's a great sort of moral gray area. You can have a lot of good people in a mercenary company. You can have a lot of bad people probably, but I think it's just such a great faction for any sort of role-playing game to have for your players to interact with. Plus, they can be flashy and interesting. They're not bound by a lot of the structures, historically or otherwise that keep things boring, and you can just have them be as bizarre and wild and exciting as you want. Game of Thrones does this great. There's tons of interesting mercenary companies in Game of Thrones, which George R. R. Martin really leaned into.
Second Sons, the Golden Company.
Yeah. Love that stuff.
What's a mercenary company that, or what type of mercenary company would fit in Darien?
Well, so I do have, the main one that I'm really excited about is the Matriarchs of Sky. And they have, they come from the Isle of Sky, and they've got, I have this convoluted backstory for why, Sky has become a matriarchy, but it's, a group of powerful women warriors who, sell their swords all around the world.
So they're Themyscira, but instead of fighting mythological evils, they're mercenaries.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's Themyscira, but, they have claymores instead of, javelins, and they're mercenaries instead of fighting Greek gods. And it works especially well in a fantasy setting, and it's evocative, and I'm still working on, symbols and things like that, but they're the most notable and powerful mercenary company in the region, and they, like I said, they mostly take contracts, but they have designs of their own, and they have their own polity which they protect, their tiny, rocky, miserable island, and perhaps want something more for it in the future.
I'm not sure where I would go with this. I had written down in one of my factions the Academy. Sort of a on-the-nose reference to Blackwater USA's current
what is it now? Academe?
Academe. Yeah. So if you want a mercenary company, right, you can either have it as an antagonist, right, or something that's an ally, or something that the players can work for. For the Academy, I think I definitely wanted basically coming to a mercenary company that had fought in the wars that had ravished the player characters' homeworlds. But now is basically its threat is sort of more that they're paying and taking some of the best warriors from the known worlds to go off and fight in other parts of the galaxy. It's bringing a lot of money to the players' homeworlds, but it's also like, ooh, what are they using all this money for? Is it taking things away?
What are their goals? Yeah, that's what's great about a mercenary company is that they can be good, they can be bad, they can very easily be shades of gray. It's very easy to write them into other parts of your plot, because it doesn't take a lot of backroom politics to explain why they might end up involved on either side of an issue.
Well, and you don't have to have every mercenary company be a army. Another faction that I have, and I don't know what this stands for, but is Mantis in all capital letters,
nice.
Right? It probably stands for something, but obviously they're more of a mercenary company in lines of assassinations.
Right.
So they will kill anyone, anywhere, for any price throughout the galaxy. Their agents are masters of disguise, that kind of thing. And they're absolutely a mercenary company, but what they specialize in is just killing one person at a time.
This is also something that that is actually a big part of our history that doesn't get talked about a bunch. But these private armies and private militaries and also private assassin guilds are very, very common, and that something like the East India Company had massive private, it was essentially like a mercenary company that often acted like a professional army. And so depending on what your world looks like, think about where these people fit and where these sort of organizations, how they keep order, because professional armies are a very, very modern invention.
Right.
And even things like a city watch or a sheriff and constables are, not all that common. The way that order was often kept, up into the modern period was pretty fuzzy and often involved paying mercenaries or somebody that looked like a mercenary. Another tier 2 organization that I love is, and this can be a tier 3 or a tier 2, is guilds or guild organizations. And so in Darien, obviously, alchemy is important. The mining and processing of quicksilver is important. So there is, of course, an alchemist's guild. And compared to other guilds, this guild wields, undue influence. They have a seat on the council of the Caledonian League. They are critical to the running of the government of Darien. And so, like the Caledonian League, they're a bit on the back foot. Things have been bad, sales have been down, and there's calcified power structures and bureaucracy that are stopping them from competing with upstarts. This is the story of real life guilds, which were mostly just systems of patronage that allowed masters and people who already had wealth to stop anyone from rising up for the ranks and competing with them. But guilds were very, very powerful and are a great sort of like foil to religious organizations or political organizations, because they are mostly interested in trade or finance or controlling the production in any sort of one area. And they can be as good or as bad as you want them to be, are just an interesting sort of like third wheel to, sort of like the politics, religion type of, dynamic in any sort of world that you've built.
What's a good example of like a fantasy guild? Would you put wizards in a guild, or are you thinking just regular sorts of people?
I mean, Dragon Age has this, right? Dragon Age has, well, it's not really a guild. They've got like that circle of mages. But a wizard's guild is a good idea, and I can see wizards fitting well into a guild. Though I think it would be more interesting to have it sort of divided by school, right? You would have a abjurer's guild or something like that, and a conjurer's guild that would all be part of like a wizard's trade council or something like that. That would be
no
more
one
interesting.
likes the Enchanter's Guild. They're
Right.
always messing with your mind. Okay. Yeah.
That would
I
be
sort of
more-
like the idea of
yeah.
having a guild for each school of magic instead of the sort of idea that all these wizards are united.
Right. I do think that if we're thinking about how wizards would fit realistically into a society, that there would be guilds of wizards. That would make very good sense.
And this is always, if you ever want an answer for like, why aren't wizards in charge? You could always, take this sort of path of, well, they're not in charge yet because they're still busy fighting each other.
Guilds are interesting, and I think that you should always think about what trade organizations or mercantile organizations exist in your world, because they were an important part of real history and also a fun way to add, a wrench to any sort of situation that you're dealing with.
For me, for trade organizations, I definitely am going to just steal the old Spelljammer monster, the Nyogi or Nyogi, the sort of spider eels that trade with anyone and trade unsavory things.
Love the spider
and
eels.
Maybe like the Mercane or something from either Spelljammer or Pathfinder, or sort of trade in high value goods type of people. But a tier 2 faction I wanted was like definitely a one way you could make a tier 2 faction is sort of nest it under your other one. So I'm going to nest this under the good union, the good federation of planets that the player characters are from. And that's going to be, I'm just going to call them right now the Guardians. Or I'll come up with some name like that. They basically want to transform the Union into a military power, to basically devote all resources to building up the military of the Union so that they can defend themselves against an inevitable invasion from one of these other empires. Are they good, bad? It definitely depends on your perspective. But they are just basically a loose association of people who've devoted themselves to defense. Many of them have experience maybe working in these mercenary companies, right? Maybe that's where that influence came from. But yeah, they just want to transform the Union into a military power.
I don't have a name for this yet, but one of my tier 2 organizations is based sort of on a little bit like Matt's union, but based on an international organization or coalition of workers. Something like, the First or Second Internationale. And it is tier 2 because it is still nascent, and it is something that people are working within, and it is in competition with basically everyone else, and is at any point ready to be squished by one of the large powers. But I always am wary of this because everyone knows my politics, and so I try to not put things that I get excited about into my games because I worry that I will overemphasize certain things. But I think that it's fun to think about because our history is so nationally bounded. Most of the history that we learn is the history of a country, still to this day. And so we don't think about groups that organize or work across boundaries. And so that's why trade organizations are interesting to me, why guilds are interesting to me, why, certain religions are interesting to me. I love thinking about things that work transnationally, oceanically, things that organizations that might transcend those borders. And I think that
the non-aligned movement, for example,
for all of its real life shortcomings, I think the Internationale is very interesting that way, and I think it's fun to put that in a fantasy setting and have players work within that or work against it.
Okay, I think before we end, we should talk about what are you should also try and make your factions as detailed as possible, and make some factions that I like to call tier 3, which is basically a faction that your players could confront or master in some way. If it's a good aligned faction, they could become the leaders of it. If it's a evil faction, they could completely destroy it or stop its immediate plans in basically their first adventure arc.
Right.
If in traditional fantasy, this could be a faction with just influence in a couple villages or a local area, or they just care about one thing. So a tier 3 faction or two, right? Something that players can immediately confront.
And the first thing that springs to mind, and I think that as cliche as it is, every setting should probably have, is a gang or a criminal syndicate. Something small time, run by a handful of people or one particular asshole that, just shakes down local people. I would probably be, I love shades of gray and subtlety. I would probably be pretty unsubtle with this. I would say, there's a group of evil criminal assholes, and they're shaking down the good folk of this city or this town or this district, and they need to be dealt with. Yeah. Another good option is
okay, I've got one of those. So for my campaign to put a little twist on it, right? The Union is a sort of idealistic place, but there's lots of poverty and inequality and the things that often lead to organized crime in the capital of the Union, and much of the trade and things go on there is controlled by the Renate clan, which are started by a group of frog people, but anyone can become basically made, and they control the docks and stuff like that. They could easily become the allies or the enemies of the party, depending on their own opinions on organized crime, right? They do a lot of bad things, but hey, they protect the people, they help them out, They're a family.
This reminds me, another good tier 3, and actually this is kind of an overlap, but is like a noble family or just a family with a powerful patriarch or something like that, or a matriarch that wields undue influence in a town, and maybe they're the mayor, or maybe they're, the head of the council of elders, and everybody knows. Anybody who grew up, the thing is, anybody who grew up in a small town probably knows a family like this, or, kind of has an idea of who I'm talking about. And they don't always have to be evil, but it's a great idea of a loose organization, a tier 3 type of faction who you might want to curry favor with, or you might want to, like Matt said, confront and overthrow or overturn or change in your first adventure module. And this is a great place to put some particularly interesting NPCs. If you have an idea for somebody that you want your players to be in conflict with, there's countless examples of this great television and movies, with one family that just has a town or an area just, in their grasp.
Do you have a faction like this in Darien?
Yeah, there's lots of noble houses in this world, and I have this idea that much like you, the players will start in sort of like a poor district of Darien, the docks, and there's one particular family that I'm still like waffling on the name on, but they have a contract with the Caledonian League to handle, all of the shipments of grain, and they're grifting. People are going hungry in the poor parts of Darien because they're skimming off the top, and it's a very early opportunity for players to engage with the politics of the world, and try to figure out how they're going to relate to the factions, both small and large.
Okay. So for a tier 3 faction, something that players could confront at the very beginning, I want to add something in a little different direction. I think it's a staple of both fantasy and science fiction, which is where I want the overlap to have some sort of military leader or powerful person who betrayed the good people and have head off to do their own thing. You see this in Star Trek and in Warhammer 40K. Star Wars. So my last tier 3 faction is going to be the Legion of Boros the Apostate. A paladin who probably served in the war, the revolution, independence, but basically somewhere out in the blackness of space, decided that, the heat death of the universe was the key to renewing all things or something like that. So Boros has somewhere in the dark a floating armada of blackguards or anti-paladins or evil paladins, depending on whatever edition you use. And back in the normal world, they might have some agents of mad cultists who want to believe in this. I like this type of faction in that the players could, let's say she's only a 5th level paladin. The players could easily defeat them, but they have some resources. And, maybe that thing that drove them mad is in fact a tier 1 faction, just doesn't have a lot of influence yet. There is some creeping chaos that wishes for the extinguishing of all heat.
Right. And the great thing, I would, the best thing in my opinion to do with a tier 3 is that allow the players to defeat it, right? Allow them to take down the corrupt patriarch or the mad warlord or the criminal syndicate, but then reveal that they were either in service to or being manipulated by a much deeper and more grave threat, your tier 1s. Right. This is my favorite way to reveal, that the scope of the game is much larger than players might have initially thought.
Yeah. But I think it's always a good idea to just have a couple things that players can totally wrap their campaign around for the first couple levels, right? Yeah. An anti-paladin, a mob, perfect for that kind of stuff.
So there's probably a bajillion more things to talk about here.
I have a list of like 30 factions.
Yeah, and I think of all of like the large sections that we've done religion and magic, we've done politics and government. I think we should probably talk. We'll come back. What I'm saying is that we'll come back and we'll maybe do some more focused episodes where we would drill down on some like finer points, perhaps.
Yeah.
But if you have any questions about anything that we brought up or want us to go into further detail about anything, absolutely write us.
Yeah. If you want a specific type of world building to be our next episode, let us know.
Let's answer a couple of questions though before we go there.
Oh yeah.
Thank you as always for writing in. Matt, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Here's a quick letter from our friend, from one of our listeners. Here's a quick letter from Scott. Scott writes, "Hey, Rob and Matt, I'm running my PCs through the woods towards a ruined tower. I would love some suggestions for setting scenes, moments, and whatnot. What are some strategies to employ between encounters? Love the show. Cheers, Scott."
This is a great question. I mean, if it's an active, like if it's time sensitive, I would say don't let the energy drop and crunch it. as much as you want. Feel free to just gloss over this part as much as you like. You can try to narrate in a very exciting way what's happening, but I would, if you're worried about creating tension and keeping that up, then don't let them drop initiative. Keep your battle music going. Say that you ride hard for the tower, and you get there, and then bam, the next thing happens.
So Scott says in his question, through the woods to a ruined tower. You have to think, are these woods important? If they're not something you ever want your players to come back to, then exactly what Rob says. They get through the woods to the tower. A quick narration is fine. If there's going to be other things in the woods or your players are interested in them, then, have some sort of challenge or something interesting. It could be as simple as, your players run across a fairy circle of mushrooms. They investigate. There's nothing there for them to destroy or fight, but they find out, their druid can figure out at certain times of the cycle of the moon, this will take them into the Shadowfell, the Feywild, right? Or give them some other hint of what other threats lie in the wood. If you want to build the tension for the ruined tower, they can find some evidence of the creatures that inhabit it. So you can use it to preview a distant threat or what they're riding to.
And this is a great question because I have some players who often thwart my attempts to build tension by stopping and focusing on something that's not important. And so a great way to avoid this is to have them be chased or have them be pursued by, something that's frightening and or challenging enough that they can't just ignore it or turn around and kill it, or keep sending things at them to keep the tension up.
Or it can be something, it doesn't always have to be something that's trying to kill them, right? Perhaps they're being followed by an awakened squirrel that was the last heir of the druid that once protected these woods and has a few clues of information about the ruined tower because the squirrel is 400 years old. Or perhaps it's just a mischievous fae that is going to play some pranks on them.
Yeah.
Steal the awakened squirrel. It's a favorite of mine.
An
awakened squirrel with 18 intelligence.
Here's a pro tip. People love talking animals. Every time I put a talking animal in my games, my players have tried to make it their best friend and include it in every subsequent adventure. So talking animals, throw them in there. People will always remember that and pay attention to it. Yeah. Great question. It's really on you to decide how important the intervening area is. If it's not important, skip it. If there is interesting stuff there, make sure that you don't have to railroad them, but maybe overload the tips, ratchet up the tension with selective encounters, and make sure that you, through both your narration and the actual events, make sure that your players know what the stakes are.
To get a little meta, and I don't mean this in an insulting way, Scott, is that, everything that your players deal with is an encounter of some kind, right? Unless there's something for your players to do, to talk about with each other or with the NPCs, or a challenge to overcome or an ally to be gained, it's not really part of the game, right? If you're just describing something, no one really cares about that. So if you want to add something between two things, right, that itself is some kind of encounter, right?
Right.
So you can think about it as an intermediate encounter or something like that, but it if you're just describing things, no one really cares about that, in my experience.
Yeah, I'll agree with that.
Right.
Narration can be exciting, but that's a learned skill, and that's often your players, even if you're very, very good at it.
No one wants to be narrated to. They want something they can fuck with, right? They can poke with a stick in some.
Your narration should be very short and lead to what do you do
immediately. Yes.
How do you interact with
how
this
do
thing?
you interact with this thing and kill yourself is basically all players want.
That's all they want to know. How can I use this? How can I kill this?
How can I endanger my friends? By messing.
How
with
can
this
I become more powerful or wealthier by interacting with this thing? Thank you for writing, and I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Scott.
We got one more from Cinderblock Sally. Sally, thank you again for writing in. And the core of Sally's question is about creating atmosphere, which is a great question. I really like this. And they want to know what advice/gimmicks we have for creating emergent cinematic moments for our players, or for creating uplifting, emotionally important moments that your PCs bring to the table. And Matt, I'm curious what you have to say about this. I have some ideas, but I'm curious about your approach to this.
I mean, the biggest thing is some stuff I've hit on before. Is if you want your players to get emotional, it's got to be something that they want to do already, right? Usually this is something that they say, hey, I want this to come out in play. The biggest tip I have is just to give them lots of time, right? Give them lots of time with their characters, time with NPCs or decisions or plots, right? And really to just back off if you want players to get emotional.
It's hard to come up with a good answer for this because it just has to do with creating realistic NPCs and realistic relationships, and that's hard to do.
Right. The answer to this question is do everything well in every part of being a dungeon master.
The only way to get your players to have like emotional resonance with your game is to run a really good game, and some games will never get there. I have been very lucky to have players who are invested and want to be a part of it. And I have created what I think are some very emotionally resonant moments where NPCs they cared about died, or they had to rescue NPCs that they cared about, or that they had, meaningful relationships. But you can't really force that. Right. Everybody has to come to the table wanting to be involved. Everyone has to be enjoying themselves and be engaged with the game. And it is, frankly, you just gotta do a good job.
And our letter writer asks what sort of advice or gimmicks. I guess I just have one gimmick that I use, right? Which is if you're looking for this kind of stuff, sometimes you can describe to your players, right? If you've really got the idea of your game is like a TV show or something that you're all making, where the camera is. And, so this is just, again, part of backing off, but you could say, all right, this thing has happened. The camera is focused on the two of you lying in the exploding crater that was once your friend. What's going on here? Describe this scene for me, right?
This is great. One of my GMs who runs my Burning Wheel campaign is a very visual person, and he will often stop and say, okay, imagine as if this is a camera or a TV show, and this is what I'm seeing, which is actually a great way to like describe or present like the emotional resonance of a moment. He's very good at presenting like a cinematic view of what's happening.
Right. If you want cinematic movements or moments, use cinematic language. Say, this is what's in the frame of the shot.
And you don't have to be explicit about this.
Or let your players tell you what's in the frame of the shot.
But this can be very helpful for most modern people, even if you're very literary. But it has to do with narration. It has to do with your tone of voice. It has to do with how you're presenting it. And that's just work. One gimmick that's very easy for some things, which is, frankly, I only have ever been able to do this for battles, but it's music. I have really come around to battle music, which ratchets up the tension. I imagine that if you were an incredibly skilled dungeon master with far more organization than I have, you could align music to other events. I have never successfully been able to have ambient music that captured the tone I was trying to accomplish. So there are a lot of offerings for just ambient and atmospheric music on Spotify and elsewhere, specifically for gaming. I would encourage you to try this, especially for battles that are important, to throw up some epic music and let your players know that something important is happening. But this is a gimmick that is tricky to do right.
And again, I think my big advice here is it takes players a really long time, like in the moment, to formulate something that is moving or emotional or resonant or things like that. Try not to interrupt, especially if a player lets out, my character is feeling this, right? Instead of jumping in and saying, here's the next thing that happens, just let things hang, right? And if players want to have that emotional moment, it's going to take them time, right? No one can come up with this stuff at the spot.
Yeah. The other real gimmick is just to have recurring characters recur frequently, even when they're not critical to the plot. Have them be around, NPCs that they would become attached to. Have them offer frequent advice or be on camera or in the scene so that your players have time to become familiar and interested in them, especially if players show interest in a certain NPC. Sometimes they'll attach to somebody you won't expect, and just have those people come back again and again and again, even if they're not written into your module or even if you didn't intend to. So they have time to become attached to them, and then you can then create emotionally resonant moments with that NPC.
If you want to, for me, I don't do the music thing, but if you want a good environment, right, especially for something somber, which is what one of the things our letter writer mentioned, is don't play in a well-lit room with fluorescent lights. Fucking turn the lights off and put candles around your table. The cover of darkness gives us a little more freedom to be a little more emotional or outside our comfort zone with this type of stuff.
This is actually a great point, Matt. Great gimmick. Your lighting makes a big difference, and a lot of us I know are limited by where we can meet. But if you have a choice and you have control over it, turn the lights down a little bit. Not a ton.
Don't play a role-playing game unless you can play on the floor on a tiny floor table on a bearskin rug that you have hunted yourself, surrounded by wood fires.
Yeah. But that's a good tip. Yeah, lighting matters.
If you have to play in a shitty conference room that you've rented out or classroom, then don't play a role playing game.
Sometimes you have to, but it does make a difference. All right, thanks for writing in, everybody.
Hey, thanks for writing in. And I think this listener sent us a song they recorded. So if we get permission to use that, we might use that to play us out. So thanks again, Cinderblock.
And if you have questions for us, I think we are working through, finally, our backlog of questions. Please write in at DMofNone@gmail.com. Add us on Twitter at DMofNone.
Yeah, send us your favorite factions that you have made up.
Oh, yes. Let us know about factions. And if you have questions about anything we've talked about, I think Matt and I could talk about this particular aspect of world building indefinitely. So if there's anything you want us to sort of focus on, we would love to talk about that more. If there's something about world building that you want us to talk about in more detail or the next topic, we can. We might talk about geography at some point. It's a strong one for Matt. Didn't you win some sort of geography B in high school?
Yeah, I was runner-up, Rob.
I'm sorry.
State runner-up at the Oklahoma Geography Bee. I did not go get to meet Alex Trebek.
I'm sorry to hear that. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I didn't mean to bring up
My whole life has just been downhill from that one failure. So
we'll talk geography. We might talk. I guess we could do an economy episode. Ooh. But
maybe I think the next one should be plot hooks.
Yeah, that's a good idea, actually. That's much more interesting.
Artifacts of your world. Ancient civilizations that have long gone. Yeah, what ruins populate your
plot
world?
Hooks is a fun one. We'll do that one next. But yeah, write us in. Let us know if you have any questions. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening.
Keep rolling them dice.
When you're deep in a dark dungeon and the cleric's down and dying, and you've taken all the potions you had left, and you feel like you are doomed because the demon you set loose is coming after you and you can smell its breath. And the door between you and it is pretty thin, and the wizard is all out of spells. The fighters took a few too many hits. This thing, it came from hell. It seems like it can't be killed. Well, don't ever give up. Not all fights are won by skill. Some are won by luck. Oh, don't ever give in. You gotta keep on trying till you lose or you win. Oh, cross your fingers, roll the dice. Wait with hope for the big 2-0. Cross your fingers, roll the dice. Let it go, let it go, let it go. Let it roll, let it roll, let it roll. Don't give up yet, no, don't ever quit. There's always a chance of a critical hit. Of a critical hit. The biggest, baddest beasts could have easily been beat by one lucky shot. Dragons have fell and kingdoms have been saved by people giving everything they got. By people who never gave up. By people who know how to let the dice roll and see what comes up. No, we never, ever give up.